Hello, 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 everybody. We are so excited tonight. We're excited to share a much needed conversation that we're going to be having about um, justice, the way forward. And it's going to be a very exciting time. So, do me a favor when you get on here tonight, go ahead and share this live video. Share, share, share. Let's make sure we have our friends and family on here to be a part of this conversation. We have some pretty phenomenal leaders who are causing great change in the community, and we want to make sure that this information is going out there. And so tonight, guys, our event is called Racial Justice: The Way Forward. And I'm going to allow, a couple of amazing people to go ahead and introduce themselves. But before we do that, I just want you guys to know that we are doing this on the behalf of Genesis Christian Church under Dr. Owen Facey. We are so grateful to be here and that he has pulled this entire thing together so we can have a much needed conversation. And also on the behalf of LogIn 2.0, we are an inclusive and authentic environment where we explore the matters of faith within the millennial generation. And we celebrate Christ, we share his love and engage communities to transform lives to become faithful disciples of Christ. So this is what we do here in Login 2.0. And what I want to do is I want to introduce Pastor Owen Facey. Before we do that, my name is Nikki Price. As many of you may know, do us a favor, go ahead and share this live. We have to get this content out tonight so people can come and tune in and watch this, share this, do watch parties. Let's get this out. And also do us a favor, follow us on Facebook on the Genesis Christian Church page. And then you can also follow us at Login 2.0. So what I want to do really quick is have the visionary, the man of the hour, the one who put this all together so we can come together and have a much needed conversation, to come on and talk a little bit about his vision and what we're going to do tonight. So Pastor Owen Facey, thank you so much for the opportunity, and it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Nikki. And it's such a joy to be on this forum with this really incredible bunch of leaders. And I just want you to know that we have on this panel tonight educators, we have pastors, we have community leaders, we have thought leaders. And I'm just delighted and humbled to be a part of this wonderful, wonderful experience. And to be honest with you, the impetus that really led us here was really what some of the things that have been transpiring in our country for the last little bit relative to racial injustice. And this is something that has been around with us for a very, very long time. And some of you might have even heard me say this before. We land a man in the moon and we do these incredible things, invented some of the greatest things that are shaping people's lives today. But it seems as though as a country, we just can't seem to get a hold or get a handle on this issue of racial injustice and the equality of all races. And so we believe that this is a very important time, not just for us to have this conversation, but for us to look at ways that we can build on the legacy of our past leaders who have fought and given their lives for the cause of equality and justice in our country here. I believe we have an important role to play in this, and that's why we've pulled together this group. And so we really want to see a lot of people coming together through this to mobilize for change. So Nikki, thank you so much for hosting this tonight. And thank you to my wonderful panelists. And we really look forward to having an engaging discussion tonight. So thanks so much, Nikki.
Awesome. 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 Thank you so much, Dr. Facey, Pastor Dr. Facey, I always call you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And so what I want to do next is introduce our phenomenal guests, the leaders, the change agents in our community who are doing some amazing work all across this country. And I want you guys to take a moment to share a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you're up to, because we know you're up to some really big things right now. So first of all, I want to go ahead and have Dr. Ennis Edmonds to go ahead and introduce himself and just get us really comfortable and connect with you tonight.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ennis Edmonds. As it was said, I am a professor of religion at Kenyon College in Ohio, and I do teaching and research which falls somewhere at the intersection of religion, race, and Black identity and Black dignity. Teaching African-American religions, religion in America, and African diaspora spirituality in the Americas. I'm happy to be here, and I am ready to learn and to share the little knowledge I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ennis Edmonds. Thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Andrew Smalling.
Well, good evening, everyone. Genesis Christian Church, it's good to be with you and the auspicious panel that we have here. My name is Andrew Smalling, and I have the distinction of not only being a law enforcement expert, I hope, but I'm also running for sheriff for Broward County. And this is an interesting time for law enforcement because we are in the midst of a change, and I hope it's a change that is going to take effect. I hope it's a change that's going to be long lasting, and I hope it's a change that's going to benefit America and the people that we serve in the community. So I'm looking forward to this panel discussion, and I hope to learn as much as I impart. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Smalling. Next up, we have Reverend Dr. Lois G. Thompson.
Good evening, and I just thank God for allowing me to be part of this panel. I was the senior pastor at an inner city Baltimore urban church for approximately 30 years, and I'm actually ordained with the Assemblies of God and work on the board of Christ is King Ministry and assist Genesis with the prayer ministry, the small group Bible study, and wherever I can assist throughout the country, actually, in preaching and teaching the truths of God's word.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Thompson. Next up, we have Dr. Owen Facey.
I guess I'll go ahead and do it again. I thought I was already introduced, but I'm Owen Facey. I'm the pastor of Genesis Christian Church. Also a professor at Broward College as well, and a business owner here in the city of Coral Springs. And my heart really is for change among our young people, change in our community. And really, I'm just delighted to be a part of this tonight. And much like everybody else is saying, I'm here to learn and I'm here to impart the little I really know.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Facey. Next up, Attorney Joe Kimmock.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Kimmock. I am a candidate for state attorney here in Broward County. I'm running on a campaign to dismantle mass incarceration and build a new criminal justice system. In my day job, I am a criminal defense lawyer. I work for a state agency called Regional Conflict Counsel. I exclusively represent folks who can't afford a lawyer. Represent people charged with everything from misdemeanors all the way up to homicides, including folks that are facing the death penalty. I represent a lot of kids, and I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. I'm really honored to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Attorney Kimmock. Next up, Rabbi Ivan Bronner.
Hi, Shalom. Welcome, and thank you so much for putting this together. This is so needed. My name is Rabbi Ivan Browner. I travel around the world, mostly Asia. I live in Tokyo, Japan, and I do interfaith work, and I work with a lot of families who are mixed families of different religions and trying to find their own voice and how to express themselves and how to find a common ground with each other. This is a thrill for me to be here, and I am so much looking forward to learning from each one of you and sharing together. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Next up, Pastor Rodney S. Rump.
Good evening. Blessings be to all. I'm Pastor Rodney S. Rump Sr. from the First St. John Missionary Baptist Church of Naranja. I'm also a history teacher at Everglades High School in Broward County, and also the head football coach at Everglades High School in Broward County. So I kind of deal with kids on a different level And I'm just honored. I'm humbled to even be considered to be a part of such an amazing panel. And like I say, I got my pen with me. I got my paper. I'm ready to learn as we sit on this panel so I can educate others into what we're talking about on tonight. Bless you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pastor. And Dr. Eddie Connor.
Mute. Good evening, everybody. Let me begin by saying how honored I am to share with these powerful panelists. Thank you, Pastor Facey. Thank you, Nikki Price, and of course, Genesis Christian Church for the invitation, including me in this rather important conversation. And really from Genesis to where it seems as if we're living in Revelation. I believe tonight's conversation will reveal steps whereby we can take action. So James Baldwin said, be Black in America, to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. The Bible said to be angry and sin not, and I've been able to transform my anger into action as a mentor, as an author, as a college professor, and a host of the Vision Summit, focused on education, empowerment, and entrepreneurship. So thank you so much, and look forward to sharing in this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Eddie. Listen, I am lost for words right now. I'm so excited for what we are going to do tonight in the conversation we're going to have. So listen, I want us to just like really get straight into it. Anybody watching, if you have any questions at all, feel free to write them in the comments throughout the entire conversation. And we can always come back and make sure we touch on those questions for you. So we're going to get started, guys. First of all, this question is for Pastor Rodney and Reverend Dr. Thompson. Okay. And you guys can answer at any point. One of the big issues that has historically been discussed in our country is systemic racism. Tell us a bit about the history of race relations in our country, and either one can start first.
I yield to Dr. Thompson.
Okay. Dr. Thompson, you got to take it off of mute for us.
Good evening again. Thank you for deferring to me. And what I basically wanted to address in this portion is the fact that none of us would have thought that at the beginning of 2020 that we would be infected by two viruses, the COVID and the virus of racism. And one of
We can hear you. You're perfect. We can hear you.
Okay.
Yes.
Was the two viruses, the COVID virus as well as the virus of racism. And when we look at them, there was some commonality between the two, in that with the COVID virus, it was invisible. No one really knew necessarily where it came from, and it came suddenly, and it affected all Americans as well as worldwide. And with racism, with the event that occurred, we actually found that not only did it affect America, but it also had effects worldwide. And it brought our attention back to the visible and the invisible things that racism has been insidious in our society with over the past 240 years and probably beyond that. And one of the things that I thank God for this format is that we can look at the fact that one of the things that is dominant in racism in America, especially those of the African descent, is that there has been an ideology that is beyond the mindset that has created these systems that have been used throughout the years to identify, to not only identify, but to control, to manipulate, sometimes to intimidate, and even eradicate the African American voice here in America. So what we see is an ideology that actually places one group as superior to another. And whenever this occurs, then you're going to have systems that flow out of this ideology that end up oppressing others within that system. When you think of the virus, there are parts of it that is visible and there are parts that are invisible. And it's the same thing with racism. It's easy to identify the races that are overtly evil, but it's harder to identify racism in its subtle part in America. And so what actually occurs is many people do not feel there is systemic racism or oppression when you speak to those that are of the dominant ideology, because they do not feel the effects of it because it's subtle. However, those that it's practiced against very easily can tell that it's evident and it's present. And I mean to say that in that when a person has a virus, there are certain symptoms we look for. When the virus of racism is practiced, those of us who are of African American descent can recognize the symptoms, but those that are actually perpetuating the racism may not recognize them, and therefore have made themselves believe that it doesn't exist. When in America, we have very subtly hidden it to the point of being invisible. It could have just been ignoring you. It could be talking over you. It could be just simply not recognizing your presence. It could be an unequal justice in the system. It could be one of the things. My father was kind of a comedian, and we have a tendency sometimes, and many of us have experienced it. You go in a place and you're Black, and everybody starts moving their pocketbooks to the next arm, or they will start making sure that all of their things that they are holding that they have near them. And I remember my father went into one place and with my mother, and everyone started doing this. And he told my mother, Lois, there must be a thief in the place. And the Blacks got it, but many times the whites did not find it very funny. But there are so many instances of subtle racism that is practiced on a day-to-day basis that most of the um, group that is dominant in America for controlling the system is unaware of. And because they're unaware of it, they many times don't believe that it exists, and if they believe that we're exaggerating. I think one of the things that basically touched me the most about racism was the Dred Scott decision in 1857, when they made a decision that said that even though you were in a free state, which he was in Missouri at the time, and they had the Missouri Compromise, that they said that the Supreme Court went against the binding laws of the Constitution and said that he was not a citizen of the United States and therefore could not bring a suit against the federal government. And then not only did they state that, but they said that no one that was enslaved would be or was a citizen of the United States. And I think this ideology has been so ingrained in the minds of people without really voicing it, that it has caused many systems, many laws, many acts to be written that have been broken and revised, that have allowed us in America to have to suffer um, many injustices. And I do believe, though, that there is only one truth, there's only one right. We fight for rights all the time, except there is only one right, and that is the truth of God and His Word, and that He is the answer. And I just want us to focus on the fact that even though you don't think there's racism, even if you don't believe that these things have been perpetuated, we each need to examine ourselves and begin to look at those things that we have participated in that have in some way dehumanized those of African American descent, and those that have also dehumanized others who we feel, who many of times white America feels are inferior to them. I just want to um, take us back to the truths of Scripture, that all life matters, that we were all created in the image of God, and all of us will give an account, because even as it says in Revelation, that in heaven there are, as John looked in heaven, he said he saw someone from every tribal group, someone from every nation, someone from every tongue. And so you're not going to change who you are when you get to heaven. You're still going to be recognizable for who you are. And so we've got to learn to start practicing what we're going to see in heaven before we get there.
This is good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Reverend Thompson. And I know Pastor Rodney probably wants to share a little bit on that as well.
Yeah, I just, based on the history of systematic racism, what has happened in our country has been a unveiling of sort, because it never left. It's always been present. And there's always been a fight for inclusion in our nation. And what happened, as many believe, in our today's society, it's just being filmed, but it has been happening for an extended period of time. Even when you go back to historically, when the country was formed, there were many of us that are in positions now in this country that were not included when the country was formed. And so the battle for us have always been trying to be included instead of excluded. And so this system has been going on for a while. The problem that many of us face is we normally, as Dr. Thompson said, we normally just address the symptoms and never address the root of the problem. And thereby we pacify it and try to believe that it will go away eventually without addressing the root of the problem, which is that it exists. And until we start sitting down and saying without a shadow of a doubt that racism does exist in this country, then we can sit down and come up with rational thoughts about how to defeat it. And it's a wild thing, because those of us that have experienced it in our lifetime, when we look at this situation and we consider ourselves the George Floyds because of some of the stuff we went through. And some of us even now are asking the question, where were the marches when we were going through our trials and tribulations? Because this system has been there for a while. And so the argument, I think, historically is, when are we gonna sit down and just acknowledge the fact that it exists, and then come up with plausible rationale, plausible solutions to fixing the problem? And then not only that, but act upon them by forcing legislation that will address the issue. It's not just enough to identify it and say it, but if you, like, for example, if they tell you you got cancer, but then you deny treatment, then you can't get mad when cancer overcomes. And so the thing that we're dealing with right now is it has been identified that it exists. What are we going to do now? We're going to accept the pacification and then expect it to go away, or are we going to fight until change comes about that would affect all human beings? We're not just talking about one race, we're talking about all races, because when you look throughout history, every race has experienced racism in some shape, form, or fashion, and it's just how we deal with it. I think is a major issue now is what's next, and so that's what I think the panel and we talk about is important. What's next?
That is so good. Thank you so much, Pastor Rodney. And that's a good question, because that's the whole reason why we're here today, is to not only have this conversation, but what are the next steps for us? What are we going to do next as a collective to move forward? So that's amazing to start there. This question is for Rabbi Browner. Is there something in our history that lends itself to the belief that one race is superior to another? Now, we see evidence of this in the Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, and slavery. So you can share from there.
Thank you so much. And I just have to say that I learned so much from listening to Reverend Thompson and our colleagues here. this is a very important question, because I think as you uncover the how to move forward and change the dynamic of what we're facing, it's really important to see the root. And Dr. Thompson said it perfectly. We have to see the root. And you know, there's a part of the scriptures. King David said, "You let your enemies grow up like weeds, so you can cut them down at the same time." And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing that dark inclination that has been under the surface growing so strong and so high for everyone to see, for the light to shine onto it, so we can now go ahead and really address it and cut it down. Now, again, being a Caucasian Jewish man, you know, I have to say that what the African American people are facing right now, no one who has not been in that shoes will be able to understand fully. People can say, "Hey, I get it, I sympathize," but you know, that's like going to somebody and saying, "Oh, my dog just died," and everyone says, "Oh, I feel really bad for you," you know. But when you lost your dog, you really feel the pain, and no one can share that with you. They can say, "I feel bad for you," and you can nod and say, "Okay, I thank you for your sympathy." But you know what? When you're in my shoes, you can then go ahead and feel the emotion and feel the pain that is thrust upon you, and then see it from the other side. And I think everyone has to see it from the other side, but we need to dig deep. You know, the answer to this question is there's always been some type of cultural divide. There's always been a part of a society that has always tried to impose their will. And then we call this in the Talmud the prevalence of the strong man. There's always someone that rises ahead and thinks their view is correct and thinks their vision is right, and they try to push that view onto everybody else. And if they don't listen, there's violence. And if they do listen, they lose all of their identity and they get consumed by that vision. And then one day, everybody wakes up. It's like waking up from a dream, and they realize, hey, I have a culture. I come from a proud culture, and you cannot crush a culture. It's impossible. Now I'm going to share a story with you. When my family, I lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. One of my great uncles was in Auschwitz. When Auschwitz was liberated, the U.S. military group that came in to liberate Auschwitz, the first regiment that went in there was African American. And when my great uncle came out of the barracks that he was in, and he saw all of these GIs there, and they ran over to him and his friends, and they hugged him and they lifted him off the ground, and they showered them with love and heartfelt horror of what they saw. You know, there's no boundaries at that point. People are people. And we need to teach the children. And I'm so glad this is a youth event, because all of the children and the youth ministry that's tuning in, it's their mission to get through this, using the guidance of these elders that are here. You know, we can shed the light, we can shed the history, but the guy that's going to pick up the carrot or the stick is going to be all of the young people. Nobody's born learning how to hate. In Jewish we call it a neshama, a soul. That soul is pure. We say every morning, "Thank you, God, for restoring this pure soul within me." That soul comes from God. It's a gift of God. Everyone needs to remember that no one is above anybody else. Everyone has right to be what's called Tselem Elokim, which means they are created within the image of God. And in the image of God, man is created and woman is created. So I think the role that everyone has to take is a very deep introspective role, because we all have two natures. We've got what's called the Yetzer Hara, which is a dark inclination, you know, and we have the Yetzer Tov, which is the light inclination. And this part of us is always battling against each other. What is the right course of action to take? What would God want us to do? What is right in our society to do? The more we can help enlighten people to know that there is no culture that is above another, and there is always a commonality and always a line that we have to find. the sooner our young people can get together and try to really move forward and find the course of action that could help bring an end to this, what we're seeing right now. Me personally, I see all of the protesting, I see the rage, I feel the anguish that's being released from just decades and decades and decades of just oppression. And it's my hope that their voices can be heard and everyone can come to a table. We could try to circumvent the violence and open a dialogue and grab each other's hands and move forward. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be a part of this panel and to share the wisdom that's being said to all the young people. Thank you.
Awesome, Rabbi. Thank you so much for that. And, that brings us into a whole new perspective. And, just to connect with that, this question is for Dr. Edmonds and Dr. Facey. Is there a difference between the history of African Americans and Afro-Caribbean living in this country? What's the difference, if any?
Dr. Edmonds, why don't you take it?
Okay, I guess I'll go ahead first. I think there is a similarity of history in some ways, especially because we all went through the crucible of slavery. And actually, if there's any difference as far as slavery is concerned, maybe the Caribbean version of slavery was more brutal in a sense. It is estimated that life expectancy in the Caribbean during slavery was 70 years after the arrival on the slave ship. And this was particularly true of Haiti. Most people died within 70 years and were replaced by others. For economic and environmental reasons in the United States, slaves tended to live a little longer, particularly because in those days, back in the 17th and 18th and early 18th century, American slave owners were not as economically well off, so they couldn't replace their slaves as easily as they would in the Caribbean. I think after emancipation, there was probably some divergence. Well, first of all, especially in the British Caribbean, emancipation came at least 30 years earlier than it did in the United States. And then it was not followed by Jim Crow as it was in the United States. And part of this had to do with the demography. Even during slavery, there were significantly more people of African descent than there were of European descent. Okay, in fact, some of the European plantation owners didn't live in the Caribbean. They have this big thing called absenteeism, and they would just send out their representative to run the estates. So they never really set down roots, and they never increased the white population significantly. And so coming out of emancipation, the Black populations were much larger. And so in order to, it didn't bring about the kind of segregation that we find in the United States. However, there was rampant colorism, if you please, where there's a gradation of color, and the perception of who you are is based on how closely you appropriate your European, sorry, how closely you excuse me for that. Yeah, how closely you appropriate European features. So there's that kind of difference, and because of that, I think Afro-Caribbean children do not grow up under the constant gaze or under the constant white gaze, or they have not grown up under what Martin Luther King called the clouds of inferiority floating around in our mental skies. You might know, that racism exists, that white people can perpetrate racism, but you don't deal with them on a daily basis. In fact, I knew very few white people when I was a kid. All right. And so I think when African Americans, Afro-Caribbean people then come to the United States, they're less likely to be deterred or to be, deterred by microaggression. I mean, sometimes we don't even recognize it, right? I mean, I look back now on some of the things that happened in my school days, and for example, after I've made some comments in class, some white classmate would pull me aside afterward and say, oh, that was a very insightful comment and so on. And I am like, in my mind, I never said much. I'm like, what do you think? This is graduate school, right? And and I think there were like levels of microaggression going on in those situations, but that was something that I could just brush aside because I didn't grow up with this cloud of inferiority around that thing. And so, yeah, there is some difference, but there's also a lot of commonality. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Edmonds. I'll just add a couple of things to that, because I do think there are some pieces there that probably allow us to perceive our realities different. For instance, if we think back we go back to the slave trade, Blacks were pulled out of West Africa primarily, and they were brought to the New World here, the United States, to Brazil, and also to the Caribbean. We were brought here as properties. We were brought here as commodities, if you will. Okay? And so the very purpose of our being here really was to create wealth. To create wealth, not for ourselves, but for our overlords. When we think about the Caribbean, here's one of the pieces that I think is very different. Some studies show that, for instance, in a place like Jamaica and Haiti, some 97% of the population that inhabited those countries, 97% of them were Blacks. Okay, they were brought there. Now, how that translated is that in the Caribbean, you had this situation where, for instance, the master, many times, they would sleep with the slaves, and then they produced, these people were called mulattoes. And so you ended up with this kind of gradation of color. And so that began to result in a different kind of racism, because now there was a stratification. The overlords who were white, they sit at the top. Okay, then you have the mulattoes in the middle, or sometimes they were called house slaves, or versus field slaves. They had better status. Many of them could read and so forth. And then you had the slaves at the bottom. Now, part of what happened is that in the Caribbean, after you had, the abolition of slavery and so forth, the vestige of that kind of European stratification remained to a large extent. And so, of course, people who were of lighter color were given greater privileges because they were thought of as, being more, better, for lack of a better word, there. Now, part of the question that we really should be asking is this: what causes us to think that way? What causes us to treat people that way? There is a whole doctrine. You can go back as far in history as we can go. The belief that there are some races that are superior to others, the white Aryan philosophy. That's exactly what Hitler manifested when he destroyed so many Jews. It was the whole idea that Blacks and gypsies and so forth were inferior, and so only whites were superior. And so with that, this would result in genocide, it could result in slavery, it could result in all of these kind of atrocities. Well, when you think about the Caribbean, here's how this plays out there. In the Caribbean, after emancipation, or later on, the abolition of slavery, a lot of the whites ended up moving back to Europe. And so what you ended up now with is this kind of gradation of color, the mulattoes and a lot of the blacks and so forth and so on. So our reality was that, to be honest, people of color were in the dominant group. And as a result of that, this kind of manifest racism that we see here in the US, we didn't really see that as much in the Caribbean. In the US, part of what happened is that the landowners who enslaved blacks, they didn't go anywhere. Even after slavery was abolished here, they didn't go anywhere. All that happened is that the two groups are now forced to live together. And that forcing of them to live together produces this kind of systemic racism that we have, that manifests itself in our education system, in our justice system. And we can go back and talk about the various ways in history where that, it was anchored in our documents, if you will. Okay, so part of the reality of the US is that you now have the dominant white race, it continues to be dominant, and you have the minority who is black. That stratification reinforced the whole idea of this white superiority versus blacks. In the Caribbean, it's a reverse. So that actually began to play itself out more in terms of classism, if you will, based on gradation of our skin. But I think the real issue that sits at the heart of that is the idea of the white race being superior to the blacks. And that continued to perpetuate itself all the way through, because blacks were brought to the New World as commodities. And even today, in the 21st century, in the eyes of many whites, in the eyes of the system that has been put in place, we're still seen as commodities. And because of that, these kind of injustices continue to be perpetuated. And so our responsibility is to really see how we can have this change.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Facey. We're going to shift a little bit because I know I definitely want to hear from, some of our newer guests here so they can really share some of their insights out. So this question is for Attorney Kimmock. One of the biggest contentions today is that justice is not colorblind. How would you respond to that? Is this true? And why might there be that impression in the public arena?
Well, the impression is there because, of course, it's true. And we've talked a lot about history for the first part of this forum, and the history of the criminal legal system is important too. From slavery, there is a direct line from slavery to lynchings to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. It's important that mass incarceration hasn't existed forever. It started around the 1970s when we made Jim Crow illegal. It was just a replacement of a new way to continue to oppress an entire group of people. Today in our criminal legal system, people of color are overrepresented in every single part of the criminal legal system. They're stopped more than white people. They're searched more than white people. They are arrested more than white people. They are held in jail prior to their trial more than white people. They're charged with a crime more than white people. And ultimately, they're sentenced to longer sentences more than white people for the same crimes and under the same circumstances. And so knowing that, right, the question is kind of what are the solutions to that? What we know is that there are a few places around the country that have started to put in some things that actually work. One is collecting data. When police departments and district attorneys' offices are able to collect their data about who they stop, why they stop, who they charge, when they charge, and what the sentences are, and then they're transparent with that data and release it to the public, it creates this kind of internal push to dismantle the parts of the systems that are creating the racial disparities. And then the second part is to kind of eliminate the discretion that's within the system, right? And so police departments that are filled with people that are not racist are still creating racial disparities, right? And a lot of that is because of the discretion that we've built into the system. So for example, we find that when we tell police officers to sit on a corner and pull over every single person that's driving 10 miles over the speed limit, we find that there aren't really racial disparities in those outcomes. But when we tell a police officer to sit on a corner and pull over anybody who looks suspicious or who looks like they may be committing a crime, that's where we see these giant disparities, right? And so what we're seeing in both police departments and kind of district attorney and state attorney's offices across the country is this desire and this push to eliminate those areas of discretion that are creating those disparities. Places like practices like stop and frisk. In places where there's stop and frisk, we know that leads to these huge racial disparities. Practices like pretextual vehicle stops, so pulling cars over with the hope of finding something illegal inside. And then within kind of prosecutors' offices, it's things like eliminating cash bail, or eliminating what's called direct file, charging kids as adults. All of those kind of practices that we know are creating substantial, huge racial disparities in the system. When we start eliminating the discretion that's involved, we can start to see some real change.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Attorney Kimok. Amazing. I want to ask this question, and this is for a couple of our leaders here, so anybody can chime in. This is for Dr. Eddie, Dr. Facey, Pastor Rodney, Dr. Lois, or Rabbi Browner. How do we see evidence of this in our institutions? Justice, education, economic, policing, and politics.
You know, I think COVID-19 unearthed the deeply rooted racism since 1619 to really reveal how sick this nation really is. The Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley poignantly painted the picture that it literally took a virus to reveal how sick America was, not to us, but to America. And so I think this nation, as we can see, is on life support because it has choked the oxygen supply, so to speak, of freedom, justice, and equality from Black bodies. Fannie Lou Hamer declared Black people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so I don't think we live in the United States of amnesia, because it's literally a stark reminder that really for so long we have been trying to suffocate racism and cure what we didn't even create, all while waiting to exhale for 400 years in these yet to be United States of America. And so we can clearly see inequities across the board, really entrenched in the deep roots of white supremacy, which affects every area of life systematically and systemically. You know, something is wrong in America when every 28 hours a Black male is a victim of police brutality. Black people are 3 times more likely to lose their life when interacting with a police officer. Attorney Kimok mentioned many of these things. When you're thinking about education, the real PPE is not solely personal protective equipment, but I think it underscores per pupil expenditure, where racially is skewed. The fact that suburban white schools receive more money than predominantly Black public schools, coupled with the fact that you think about the mass incarceration epidemic. The 2nd and 3rd grade reading scores are used as a barometer to dictate and predict how many prisons to build. We see slavery under a new name with the new Jim Crow, disproportionately warehousing Black brothers and sisters, Black bodies who make up half of the prison population, but only 13% of the US population. And so justice is not blind. It is with eyes wide open. And politically, we're dealing with COVID-45 in the midst of COVID-19, where the problem is the president wears a mask over his eyes and not his mouth. And now we have to really, I think, make a distinction between do you want a president who has dementia, or one who's demonic, one who says, if you don't vote for me, you're not black, or the one who doesn't like blacks. And, you know, I don't know about you, but I'm tired of holding my nose and voting because of the obstinate odor from oftentimes future politicians who play politics with the least, the last, the left out, and the lost. And so I think when we think about these things, now we begin to see it with wide eyes and hopefully begin to bring some remediation on all levels.
I think it was, I appreciate what you said, and I think it's spoken well. I'm not going to reiterate, but I do think that we have to look at how systemically we have used gerrymandering, we've used zip coding, we've used zoning laws, and all other manners to keep control and manipulate the African-American community. In Baltimore and in Maryland alone, most of the fire stations that were closed in the neighborhoods where African-Americans in the inner city lived. And so therefore we saw that there were some Blacks that had been injured, and even some elderly persons who had become sick that couldn't get an ambulance because the zone in which the ambulances would have come from, because of the zip coding, and because some places won't even enter into those areas, that it affects the healthcare system. It affects the property. If your property catches on fire, it's not going to be addressed. So he has talked about the education and the government, but we have to realize it affects every aspect of our lives. And we, even when we needed the church roof repaired, you couldn't find a roofer that would come in the inner city to repair your property. And so when they get your zip code, and when they understand the zoning, and even when you're pulled up in the system, everybody knows exactly how they're going to respond to these areas because they've already taken the time to identify you as being high risk, and that it's not worth them what they think is risking their life to provide you the same services that they would provide someone else in a different area. And so I think we have to look at not just the educational, the government. I agree with the gentleman concerning the voting, when you've got basically, when they choose who you vote for, and you don't have a really choice like you did earlier on, but when you only end up with two choices that are bad, then you really are not going to be very effective in changing some things that need to be changed. But we have to see it that it is systemic, and it affects a lot more areas than just education, than just government, but the healthcare, the zoning laws, the being able to even get services for people to come into those neighborhoods. Even if you have a plumbing problem, it's very difficult to find someone that will come in the inner city and fix it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rev. Lois. Would anybody else like to touch on that before we shift to Mr. Smalling?
I just want to chime in. I appreciate Dr. Connor, Dr. Thompson. They brought some valid points. While I can speak on all of them, I'm going to talk about education, which is what I'm a part of. And for some reason, as Dr. Connor said, anything other than white is seen to be subpar, seem to be mediocre, especially when it comes to education. For example, I'm a product of Howard University. And when I sit down and I talk to my students in class, which we are predominantly Black school, and when I talk to them about HBCUs, it's literally frowned upon, as if I've cursed at them in considering going to a historically Black college and university, because it is seemed to be subpar, and that's the way it's listed, as subpar. Also, and consider education, we have to start teaching our young people the truth about their history. Right now, our school systems, and for 18 years, you've been taught European history. You've been literally taught white history. That's what you're being taught in the schools. A lot of stuff when I got to Howard University, I was ashamed that I didn't know, that I should have known about my own history. But then I realized that all I had was the European history I was taught. I was brought into this country in my school, in my lower level education. I was brought in as a slave. When they introduced African Americans into our young people, they're introducing them already being taken out of their country, coming over on slave ship. We start in our history in the Atlantic slave trade. And so if you don't know about your history, if you don't know who you are, then you lose your identity. So that's a prominent form of racism there, where they take our history from us. And so we don't know who we are. So we spend our life trying to conform to be this picture that they tell us is perfect, this picture that they tell us is right. And all of a sudden, when we fall short, we kill ourselves economically, politically, trying to be like something that we are being taught because we don't know who we are. And so when we look at it, this system is a lot bigger than what we're trying to say, just the police force. It's a lot bigger than that. And if we just focus on this one entity, then we'll lose sight on what they talked about, the justice system, what's going on in our incarceration system, what's happening in politics. All of this stuff is a whole part of the system. And sometimes what they do is they divert our attention by focusing on one aspect while they're steadily holding holding a knee to our neck with everything else that they're doing all around us. Like, for example, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Connor talked about in this presidential race, who represents us? Who can I look at out there and say, they have my best interest in mind? One is saying, don't vote for the other for this reason, but none of them is saying what they have on the agenda to make my life better, to make things better for our culture. And so when we talk about it, it's still fighting for inclusivity in this race war. It should be. But the truth of the matter, it is. And then they get mad at us and say we don't vote. And we say, you give us somebody to vote for, we will. We showed you that in 2008. If you give us somebody to vote for, we'll vote, we'll show up. You know, just saying, I'm just saying.
Yeah, can I just add just a couple of things? Because I think the issue of education and economics are tied together. Because to be honest with you, if you're going to get to good schools, you're going to have to be in good areas. Okay, in other words, maybe buy the more expensive house so you can get into the better areas, to get your kids into the best schools. But we have said enough about that. But I just want to point out just a couple of things. One sociologist by the name of Patrick Sharkey, he did a study that showed that in 1970, the wealth gap between whites and blacks is the same as it is today. The same as it is today. It hasn't changed. If anything, it has gotten wider, okay? In that same study, he talks about the fact that, white families, their wealth is roughly 20 times that of blacks. Okay, so the question is, why is that so? Well, let me give you two examples, and this kind of illustrates the kind of racism that sits in our economic system. So in 2005, that was before this great recession that we experienced, Wells Fargo promoted a series of wealth building strategies or seminars, and they dubbed this the nation's leading originator of home loans for ethnic minority customers. And they had even some Black personalities trying to push this as a way of creating generational wealth. Well, interestingly, the New York Times did this report, and they uncovered affidavits on some of those loans that showed Wells Fargo referring to Black people, the target of these loans, as mud people, and the and to their subprime products, these loans that they were giving to the Black community as ghetto loans. And so in 2011, you had the government now began to squeeze them about this, because of course we had this massive meltdown when so many banks went down and so many people lost their homes and so forth, where we saw where Wells Fargo had to pay some $175 million to the government because of discrimination against minority groups having to do with those loans. Bank of America itself had to pay some $355 million to settle charges of discrimination in their loan habits as well. So what we see is that even in the banking system, we have this kind of racism that sits there that push certain products towards minorities, towards Blacks, and they know well good that these things are going to cause them to bankrupt and lose whatever little resource that they have. And those are two examples of that. So the economic thing is tied to the education thing, because if as Blacks we don't have enough money, then guess what? We can't put our kids in the best schools either. And so some of the statistics that were shared earlier on just become natural results of that. So the question is, we then have to find a way to compete economically, to be able to educate ourselves well, to be able to have the kind of power that we need to have to make the changes that need to be made. So I just wanted to point out those two things as quick examples.
Awesome, Dr. Facey. Thank you so much. We're going to shift here and talk a little bit about the police officers. And this question first is for Mr. Smalling, and then the next question will be for Mr. Smalling and then Attorney Kimmock. So in the last few weeks, the light has been shown on policing in our country. And the argument is that minorities are specifically targeted in our policing. How do we speak to this? What really is the problem? Why are more Blacks incarcerated or killed by the police?
Well, I think that the answer to that question has probably been answered through the history that we've heard so far from our panelists. I just want to add to it from a law enforcement perspective that, one of the mottos that we use in policing and that you'll see on the side of police cars is to serve and protect. But if we look at the history of law enforcement and policing, it's to serve and protect, but not serve and protect all people. If we go back to, Emancipation Proclamation, that was 150 years ago, 150 plus years ago. But between 100 of that 150 years was severe racism and severe discrimination. And it's not really until the 60s that we start seeing some movement as far as changes to the discrimination laws in this country. So you figure for 100 years, when we talk about law enforcement and that systemic law enforcement, because law enforcement is a tool of the government. It's just like the military, it's a tool of the government. So those leaders, those law enforcement leaders are only going to progress what the folks at the top want, our leaders want. And that's interesting. I'm going to come back to that in a minute and show you how it plays in modern day. Well, I'll do it now because I remember distinctly, I was still in law enforcement when Trump was elected. And he said that don't be too kind with these individuals that you arrest. It's okay to hit them over the head and, bang their head as you put them into the police vehicle. That is a order basically from the chief officer of this nation to law enforcement, who's a tool of this nation, to participate in police brutality. So you have all of that going on. all right, the last 50 years where we have the civil rights movement being progressed, which has had its ups and downs. And one of the things that came out of the whole civil rights movement, of course, is our Voting Rights Act and things like that. But one of the things that we never got was equity in our police departments. And if you look at our police departments are now just somewhat reflecting the diversity of our communities. Not so much so in our leadership, but maybe in the officers that, and I read an article recently where there are police departments that are woefully inverse when it comes to their population compared to the communities that they serve. So all that to say that when you talk about the impact of policing on our minority communities, there's no wonder that police officers think that they can get away with the things that they do when you have an officer that sits on a person's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and thinks that they can get away with it and it's okay, is because it's been ingrained in that culture for such a long time that it's okay, coming from our Constitution where Blacks are only 3/5 of a human being. So that has, when you talk historically, that is something that has been brought about. Now, I'm not saying that all officers are this way or have this type of mentality, but when you talk about systemic, that is something that is built in the system. And I want to add to Attorney Kimmock, who, by the way, I think is going to make a great state attorney because he's very progressive, that those things inclusive of, the jail time, the disparity when it comes to jail time for minorities, for Blacks in particular, all of that was built in to take the place of what was the 13th Amendment, right? So yeah, you're free. However, there's still going to be ways that we can enslave you. And, even though people might not be, it might not be conscious for them to think this way, there's definitely a subconscious culture in our criminal justice system that breeds this type of activity.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Does somebody want to touch on that?
Yeah, could I just add something?
Sure.
So, my basic research area is on Rastafari, as some of you know from Jamaica. And Rastafari have like two different terms to refer to police. One is Babylon, and Babylon in Rastafari's discourse is the status quo, it's the exploitative and the suppressive agencies of the cultures and values of the society. The other term comes from Bob Marley, where he refers to the police standing over him as being people who were in uniforms of brutality, okay? And I'm saying this to say that the system of policing as it is used in this country and in many countries is a system that protects the status quo, okay? And the proof of that in America is this idea of qualified immunity, that the police doesn't have to bear the consequences of their action. Lawyers are subjected to malpractice, suit, doctors are subjected to it. Why are policemen not subjected to it? Okay, and I think the present discourse about defunding the police or reforming the police, I am falling on the side of we need a radical remaking of the police, because they might have that mantra to serve and protect. but serve and protect whom? And obviously the way they have been operating is to serve and protect the status quo. I mean, a good example, I mean, in America, property sometimes is more important than people, right? And if you want to see Americans get angry, let poor people start to protest and to destroy or loot or burn property. You know, but as the guy, and well, I forgot his name now, but he made the point recently in a Trevor Noah, as Trevor Noah points out, you know, they have been looting us all these years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edmonds. I want to ask this question, and I'll open this up for Attorney Kimmick and Mr. Smalling. How would you guide African-American parents practically on how to deal and interact with law enforcement? And Attorney Kimmick and then Mr. Smalling, you go ahead on that.
Sure. You know, this is both, I guess, a personal and a legal question. My wife is Black. We have a 3-year-old son together who will one day be a teenager. And so, you know, that is a very real conversation that I'll someday have to have. And, you know, I think that the conversation on this often turns on safety, right? On that it presumes that the goal of the interaction for the person of color is safety. And as a father, that would be the biggest goal for my son, right? But as a white person, I feel really uncomfortable telling people of color that safety should necessarily be their first goal in the interaction, because I not only want my son to be safe, I want him to be proud. And when a person of color is pulled over or wrongfully stopped on the street, harassed by police, there is a very real tension between those two kind of ideals, right? Between the safety of the person, but remaining proud. And so if I was, you know, telling my son, and my goal as his dad is for him to remain safe, I'm going to tell him that no matter how wrong the police officer is, no matter how degraded he makes you feel, that your goal is to get home to us safe and to survive and to listen to every, you know, order, no matter how terrible it may seem. But I recognize that for many Black men in this country, that safety, they never feel safe, and they don't feel safe. They won't feel safe when the police encounter ends. They didn't feel safe before the police encounter began, and so that having a level of pride upon leaving the police encounter is important to a lot of folks as well. And so I tell them, you know, there's the saying in court among lawyers, you may beat the rap, but you're not going to beat the ride, right? So like, if you get arrested, that arrest is going to stay with you forever. But if you're comfortable, then there's a couple of things that you should know about that encounter. One is that there's a difference between an order and a request. If a police officer requests for you to do something, you don't have to do it. If they ask you to get out of the car, if they ask you if they can search your car, if they ask you if they can search your person, if it's a request, you don't have to do it. But you have to, if it's an order, even if it's an illegal order, you've got to do it. And so I think that's number one. And then number two, this is something I tell my clients is there is no reason for you to speak to the police. You never, ever, ever have to answer police questions except other than what is your name, what is your license and registration. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, and you do feel comfortable kind of asserting yourself in that position, then you should do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Attorney Kimmick. Mr. Smalling, I definitely want you to touch on that as well. But there's been a conversation that I've heard, some of my friends say, they get so fearful when they're pulled over by cops. Is there a procedure that they should implement when that does happen? Like, do you need to have your driver's license out or your insurance, or are you needing to communicate to the officer, I'm reaching for my ID, I'm reaching for my registration? Are those practical ways to do that? Or is it even necessary for us to have to do something like that?
Yeah, in answer to your question, yes, there are some practical things that you can do that I suggest to everyone, especially when you're involved in a traffic stop. First of all, you pick where you want to stop. I tell this to especially women that are traveling by themselves. You don't want to stop in a dark area, dark wooded area. You want to go someplace where there's lights, where there are people around, and you can do that. You can pick where you stop. All right. Don't end up going 10 miles down the road, because then you might have, you might attract some other police attention to you. But you can definitely stop where you want. And most officers know this, right? They, for their own safety, they don't necessarily want to stop, in the middle of I-95 or on a busy roadway. They'd rather pull you over into a parking lot. One of the things that is common is people, like you said, reaching for different items. Do not reach for anything in your car until the officer asks you for it. One of the things that you can do, and I have it right by me, I think everybody has one, I don't know if you can see it, but this is the great equalizer, right? So I tell people that there's a record function that you have on your phone, and you can initiate that function. You can even call someone and tell them, hey, listen, you know what, I'm getting pulled over. This is where I am. I'm gonna leave this on speaker so you can hear what's going on.
Chief, I've actually had a client who called 911.
That's right.
To verify over, because 911 automatically records.
That's right.
What's happening, and so you can actually, and then it's very easily accessible as well.
Exactly, as Joe said, and also what that does, it actually verifies, because you can say to the 911 operator, I am being pulled over at this location. Do you have this traffic stop on record? Because they should, and they should be able to tell you that. So this is indeed the great equalizer. They can't stop you. No police officer can stop you from reporting an encounter. They can't tell you to put your phone away. The only time that they can get involved in taking your phone is if it's considered evidence. So if you're at the scene of a crime and you're recording the crime, then that can get you into problems, because that can be made into evidence. Upon the stop, the officer is usually going to tell you to stay in the car. Now, this is unique to Florida, because there are other jurisdictions other states where they actually tell the person to get out of the car and come back to them. But in Florida, the way it's taught in the police academy is that the person stays in the car. So don't try to get out, because when you try to get out of the car, sometimes that causes the officer to get a little antsy, and we just don't want to do that. So stay in the car, listen to the instructions that they have, make sure your hands are visible, which usually I tell folks, you don't have to put your hands up on the dashboard, but make sure you have them on, maybe on the steering wheel. It's a good place to have them. And then the officer is usually going to ask you for your driver's license, your registration, proof of insurance, those things. Now, if you have, this is one of the things in the state of Florida that is a problem, I believe, is that we have guns. Everybody in this state has guns. I don't know if us as good Christian people, we have concealed weapon permits and we carry guns, but it seems like, especially for officers on the street, it seems like just about everyone that you run into has a gun in their possession. And they'll have it in their car, right? Whether it's permitted or not. So if that's the case, you need to reveal that to the officer, especially if you're reaching into an area where that gun is. So if it's in a glove compartment, if it's in a glove box, if it's in your armrest, whatever it is, you need to let that officer know, because that could be an issue down the road. Sometimes when you see an officer approaching the vehicle, they will have their hand on their gun. All right. This is another technique that's taught in the academy, good or bad. They shouldn't be pulling their gun out, but it's just a precautionary thing for an officer to have their hand on the gun as they approach, because there have been situations where they've run into individuals that are wanted for some reason, that end up firing a weapon at the officer. So the talk, I want to go back to something that Attorney Kimmick said. That talk with our young men and women now, really, about these officers and the way they act, it's good, right? And this is something that we've always talked about in Black families, that you have to be respectful to the police, or you should be respectful to the police, listen to them, obey their orders, things like that. But then, I look at a situation like Trayshawn Brooks, is it?
Richard Brooks.
Richard, I'm sorry, Brooks, in Atlanta. And, I watched that whole tape, and I saw a man, even though he was, intoxicated or he had something to drink, the officers still let him drive, because they let him drive and put the vehicle into the parking spot. And they're talking to this guy, and he is respectful. I mean, for as long as they were out there, for the 20 minutes or whatever time that they were out there, this guy was respectful and doing what we tell our young men and women to do. And he still ended up getting shot. So, for me, as a law enforcement leader, I am putting the onus on my officers, all right? I'm putting the onus on my officers and my deputies to say, hey, listen, you all need to be the ones that are respectful to the people that we protect, that we are sworn to protect, regardless of what color they are. Because even though we're having a talk, and even though we're being as respectful as we can, we still have Black men ended up dead. And that's a problem.
Wow. Thank you so
I have
much.
a comment.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. One of the questions that I had was, do all of the officers have body cams?
Yeah, so no, not in Florida. Here in Broward County, about half the police agencies have body cameras. Broward Sheriff's Office does, but somewhere like Hallandale or Hollywood do not have body cameras. It's up to each individual city that have their own police agencies as to whether they want to have them. And it's a big problem. As a defense lawyer, I can't tell you how many cases I've tried where police beat the crap out of my client and then turned around and charged them with a crime in order to protect themselves, right? That doesn't happen nearly as often when the officers are wearing body cameras. But for a variety of different reasons, not all agencies have them.
Okay, because I had shared with Dr. Facey a video, and one of the suggestions, it was a Black policeman that was pulled over by a white policeman, but he was out of uniform. And one of the things that he stated was to make sure that the body cam is on and is recording. And I was not clear as to whether or not every jurisdiction required their officers to have body cams.
And another issue with that, when you're talking about the body cams, is even though we have these officers with body cams, they still decide when to turn that camera on and off. So it's not automatic and it's not on all the time. And that's a big issue. So if you know, we've run into situations where, you know, a excessive force act has occurred and you've got officers turning off their body cams, you know.
Correct. And that was the suggestion.
Right.
That was the suggestion that the people make, is to make sure, if they have one, to make sure it's on and recording. Because there are times when they may have you reach for something, and if it's off, it can very well be used against you if the situation becomes aggressive.
It should be automatic. I'm looking at some systems where as soon as an officer exits the vehicle, I mean, there's some privacy concerns, you know, if an officer is on a personal call, if they're doing their personal business or whatever. But anything that involves police action, so you turn your lights on your vehicle, it automatically starts recording. You step out of your vehicle on a call, it automatically starts, and it doesn't stop until that action is over. So we need something in place. You know, it's probably impractical to have a video running 24 hours or for the full
correct
of the shift, but it has to be something that is more automatic or more automated than the officer turning it off and on. And you can have legitimately an officer that ends up in some kind of situation where he has to take immediate action and forgets to turn it on. So that can happen as well.
Correct.
And just to follow up with that real quick, you know, a lot of people have been asking me, what can I do now to help change things post George Floyd? And one of those is if I lived in a city where my police didn't have body cameras, I would email all of my city commissioners, ask them why, and then get a group of people together and go to the next city commission meeting and demand that they fully fund body cameras. They will listen to you if there are enough people that are demanding it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Attorney Kimmick. We have to shift for the sake of time. I know this is such a great conversation. Looks like we're going to have to come back for like part 2, part 3, part 4. But this is so great. And everybody has been giving great insight and wisdom and information. Listen, if you're watching on Facebook, let us know, has this been good information? Is this good to you guys? If this is good, let us know in the comments. This is good. Just write "this is good" in the comments to let us know we're on track and we're on the right page. I do want to touch on something before we shift to next steps, because what's important is that we talk about what practical and actionable steps we can take from here. We have the information, we understand what's happening in our country, and now we get to talk about next steps. But before we get there, I want to ask Dr. Eddie a question for millennials. You know, I want to talk about what role do millennials play when it comes to voting at the polls, and then utilizing the power we have through where and how we spend our money. And I want you to touch on that, Dr. Eddie.
Great question. You know, I think the mountain that we as millennials have to climb is the civil rights fight for this generation, which is police reform. You know, we are disenchanted because all of our wins seemingly are in black and white from the 60s. You know, we haven't really seen any victories in color because in actuality, we're continually besmirched because of our color. You think about it, the killer of Michael Brown is still free. The killer of Trayvon Martin is still free. The killers of Eric Garner and Elijah McClain are still free. The killers of Breonna Taylor, it's been 100+ days and they still have not been arrested nor charged. So we have to not only, I think, especially as we're protesting in the streets, I think that same protest has to go to the ballot box. We have to not only vote the top of the ticket for the national election, because we surely need a change, but also the bottom of the ticket for state and local elections, you know, voting for the judges, voting for attorney generals, voting for making sure that we have good police review boards. And I think the elected officials who matter most in reforming police departments and the criminal justice system work not only on the national level, not just at the Department of Justice, but also on the state and the local levels. And so I think we need voter education coupled with voter registration. I think, as I said before, all roads of protest must lead to the polls. But I think we also, in conjunction with that, we have to be cognizant of voting with our pockets. And really, as millennials, we grew up saying it's all about the Benjamins. I got my mind on my money and my money on my mind. You know, we've been inclined to secure the bag, but how much actually stays in that bag? When you think about it, millennial shoppers spend nearly $600 billion annually in America. And so I think more than just shopping at Fashion Nova, it's got to be fashionable to save and invest. More than ordering from Uber Eats and Cheesecake Factory, I think we're going to have to really factor in how our voices become a seat at the table for lucrative opportunities rather than just suffering from laryngitis by solely being a consumer and not a creator or an investor.
That's good, Dr. Eddie. Thank you so much. This question can pretty much be for anybody who wants to answer. And, you know, for the sake of time, we have a bunch of questions that people have asked on our Facebook page. So we want to make these answers as minimal as possible if you can, so we can be able to answer at least a couple of the questions. If we don't get to every question, that is okay. We'll talk about a part 2, or we'll talk about how we can get those questions answered for you. But for our panelists, let's see if we can make this as laser sharp as we can, so we can talk about, I have 2 questions, and then also we're going to talk about the questions we have from our guests tonight. So this question is for anybody who can answer this. What might be some specific things that we can do to advocate for change relative to the issue of racism and injustice in our country? 2 parts. What practical things can we do, and where do we start? Anybody can answer from here.
I think the way to start, personally, is on an interpersonal relationship to open a dialogue. Go to your neighbor, go to someone and have a conversation. Listen to their words, really listen, and hear what they have to say. It's, to me right now, to see so many people marching together, to me, shows that people are coming together to try to really open up and help this process to take place. And the more diversity we see in these marches, and the more diversity we see people getting involved with the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that are happening, to me, that's the way to start. To everyone to step back and to really listen. And that's how this change is going to take place.
I would, oh, good.
Yeah, I think I just want to add just 3 quick things. Probably don't have time to go into them, but I think we have to collaborate. And what that means is look at past wisdom, look at what has been successful, look at those people who've gone before us leading and those who are present. Look at organizations and entities that share similar interests. And we have to learn to pull that together. Collaboration in terms of people, in terms of resources, because if we're going to foster change, we need money. Because one thing America respects is money. Okay, and it takes money to bring about the kind of changes that we need. Okay, and so that's economic part, so collaboration. But I also think education, and I think Dr. Eddie mentioned that earlier, where we have to educate ourselves about the issues, educate ourselves about our community, educate ourselves about the things that need to change, educate ourselves about what happened in the past and the victories that have been won, and understand that we're standing on the shoulders of those who went before us, and build on that. So we have to be informed voters, not just simply vote, but we have to be informed voters. So we know what we're voting for and know the change that we're seeking. But also, the third thing I think is engagement. And that's why I'm excited about people like Chief Smalling and Attorney Kimmock, who are running for office. Because you know what happens? We have to sit at the table to make changes. If we don't get there to change policies and laws and so forth, so engagement means that we have to put ourselves out there. But yes, it also means voting. Yes, it means mobilizing. And so I think those 3 things, I wish I had time to talk more about them, But I think we need to head down that road.
I will echo that from all of these incredible panelists tonight. I think anti-racism is a key factor to this as well, because Black people are often expected to cure what we didn't create. Robin DiAngelo, a white woman, wrote a book called White Fragility.
Yes.
And she asked the question, why is it so hard for white people to talk about racism? And I think white fragility is often rooted in guilt, displaced anger, connotations of all lives matter, and the lack of accepting responsibility to, I think, remediate the ramifications of racism. Because when you think about that guilt, I think really white people just really have to be cognizant of the fact that Black people don't want retribution. We just want equality, and we just want equity. And we're not going to necessarily, once we get in place of power, do to you that which was done to us. And so I think we need more Jane Elliott's and fewer Karens and Amy Coopers. Really, essentially, white silence is Black violence. And so I think we need to move from solely just sympathy to equity, advocating for equality as well as opportunity. Really, I think, to bring about that which is substantive transformation. Our white brothers and sisters, I think, as well, and that's why I'm grateful as well for Attorney Kimhock and many other brothers and sisters, white brothers and sisters like him, who have the humility to do an inductive study of racism. And many, of our white brothers and sisters have been so numbingly neglectful to our pain because white privilege allows them to, in many cases, just benefit from it. And as a result, they're blind to it. I don't think it's enough to say, I'm not racist. I think it's more, are you anti-racist? Being woke isn't good enough. We woke up this morning, but if we didn't do anything, then nothing's going to work. Faith without works won't work. And so the question becomes, are you using your voice? Are you using your influence to do as we say, as the young folks, as millennials say, apply pressure to the plight as well as the pathology of really the sinful predicament, America's original sin? And so white silence is nonverbal violence. If you're anti-racist, you're anti that which is antagonistically agonizing to your Black brothers and sisters. And so I think you have to not only speak up when you march, but you have to vote according to what it is that you were marching for. You got to vote according to that which it was when you were photographing yourself while you were protesting. And I think it comes from the fact that you don't have to look like me to fight for me, just get in a fight with me. And what our white brothers and sisters can do, not just checking white folks in the White House, but also checking the ones in your house, who are really more apt to receive from you than from me. More than just a donation or a check. I think the reality check is that we need to add more diversity. We add to these boardrooms. We need to add more leadership teams to the corporate boardrooms. If you have access to certain rooms, equity says, let me give you a key. Equity says, let me give you the code. Equity says, let me invite you into the conversation, not just leave you in a room on your own. Let me ensure that progress is made on your behalf, because I don't think we can be separated in silos. We got to be solidified together from the streets to the suites.
Oh, that's so good. That is so good.
I may just interject something. Powerful words from Dr. Eddie and from a pastor. But one thing that I want to challenge us to address is the racism within the race. Because in some instances, we talk about coming together, we talk about collaborating, but sometimes there's so much racism from within, and Dr. Eddie brought this up about looking in your own households, and sometimes we try to fight the racism without, and if we just go in our bedroom, I go next door, we'll discover that there's a lot of racism within the races. And I think that comes with education, that comes with us talking about historical context, economic context, because we can't come together and collaborate if we don't first sit down and challenge ourselves to get rid of the racism within the races, which honestly, that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. But I think honestly, that's an issue that needs to be addressed, because whether we want to accept it or not, it's very prevalent in our society where we have existing racism within the actual race itself, which can be a deterrent to us moving forward because we're so busy fighting against each other to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish.
That's good. That's good. Listen, we have some questions here, and I know we still have so much we want to say, we want to share, but I want to make sure we can touch on some of the questions from some of the people who are asking on Facebook. We want to make sure that we're tuning in with them. Before we get into a question, though, this has to be touched on so we can answer the very amazing question that we have from one of our viewers, and it's about the church. What role does the church play? The synagogues, any religious establishments? What are we doing in the church, and what can we do to be able to cause this change between people? How do we connect the church with the community? What does that look like? And I want Rabbi to touch on that, and also Dr. Facey. Please, for the sake of time, if we can make it as laser as possible, and then I have a couple of questions. We can answer probably about 2 or 3 of them. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think that the synagogue and the church, it rests on our shoulders. We're the moral voice. We're the voice that has to stay strong and has to be for the people and has to be for change. We have to root out this type of intolerance wherever it's seen, and that means allowing people to hear and put themselves in an uncomfortable situation to really open their hearts and feel the pain of the other person, and then to do what's right, to really listen and to make the congregation become one voice, to use the strength of the congregation to help educate the young people for action. And it's our responsibility as faith leaders to do that.
Could I jump in here a bit?
Yep.
Yeah, I think the most disappointing thing to me during this era, and maybe even going back to Jim Crow, is the role of the church in dealing with the issue of racism. For example, American evangelicalism could probably have the most outside influence on what is going on right now, because 45% of people in a Gallup poll in 2018 claimed to be evangelical. And the sad thing about this is that it is probably least engaged in issues of race. Maybe during the abolition era, evangelicalism was very big and the abolition of slavery. But ever since then, they have changed their tune, right? Where were they during Jim Crow? Actually, some of those churches were very supportive of segregation. Of all the Christian groups in America, the evangelicals were least present in the civil rights campaign. And in today's world, evangelicals tend to be more supportive of law and order. Evangelicals were least present in the civil rights campaign.
Go ahead. Sorry, we had some technical.
I don't know where was that echo coming from.
No worries.
So they're more likely to be invested in this law and order discourse that disadvantage Blacks and give police an immunity for their abuse. I just heard recently that young people are leaving the church, and I think mostly evangelical church, not because they don't believe in the teaching of the church, but because they believe that the church does not believe in what it teaches anymore. Okay, and if the foundation of the gospel and the one commandment that fulfills all the law and the prophet is to love the Lord your God with everything you have and to love your neighbor as yourself, I cannot see why Christians are on the sidelines at this moment and are supporting systems of oppression. I think we need to have a true kind of repentance. And you know, the Greek word for repentance means a transformation of the mind. Okay, an old Black woman, I think during the times of slavery, said, a lot of people talking about heaven ain't going there. A lot of people claim to be Christians, don't have the first idea what it means to be Christian. And I think religious leaders need to come to the point where we emphasize that the way we treat each other is the surest indication of whether or not we believe in what we teach. And until that happens, I think that there's going to be a lot of problems in terms of moving forward on this. And I did what all my friends said about we need to combine both protest with production. We have to work on ourselves as Black people are, as people of conscience. We have to work on ourselves to educate ourselves and to prepare ourselves to succeed. All right.
Good.
I think Dr. Ennis, you articulated those things so beautifully. Quickly, I really believe that the church has and you have stated clearly the evangelical church default, where they've messed up because we have no voice at this point. But I do believe part of what we can do is that one, we're going to have to look deep inside of ourselves as a church because we ourselves perpetuate racism. Why is it that you don't have more Black pastors pastoring white churches and white pastors pastoring more Black churches? Why is it that we have, we still have dominantly white and Black churches and so forth? So we have racism in our ranks. And until we acknowledge that and confess and repent from that, then we can't really take the plank out of the mote out of the other guy's eye. The other thing that I think is important is that we have a responsibility to call our nation to acknowledge the sins of their past. And until we recognize that racism is a problem and we have condoned it, we've put it in our system, we're reinforcing it and repent from it, then we can tinker around the edges all we want to. I think we need to have a national day of confession and repentance. We need to acknowledge it as a problem. That's one piece. And then I believe that the church also now has a role to educate. We need to educate our people about the issues so that they can vote properly as well. We can't tell them how to vote, but we can educate them. We can bring in political leaders to come and share so that at least they can understand and we can be more militant in terms of how we advocate for change. I won't say anything more than that, but we need to recognize that. If we believe that people are equal, as the scriptures teach, let's live it out first and let's make that a central part of the gospel we proclaim.
I echo all of that, especially with what these great pastors and preachers have mentioned. Dr. King said the most racially segregated time in America is at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. And I think one thing we have to recognize is that the church is more than a building, it's a body. We as a whole, Black, white, Hispanic, otherwise, are the body of Christ. And so I think even if you think about it, the prefix of the word gospel is go. We have been as a body of believers pushed from the building to go into our homes, go into the neighborhoods, go into the streets with what the gospel is, the good news. And so I think we can redeem the soul of America through, as the Reverend said, repentance, through reconciliation. And I really believe our Christian clarion call in the wake of COVID-19 and racism since 1619 is found in Luke 4:18 and 19, where Jesus quotes Isaiah 61. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach the gospel of the poor. He set at liberty them that are bruised, heal the brokenhearted, set at liberty them that are bruised, preach the acceptable year of the Lord. When you think about that, Jesus doesn't forget his history to move people into their destiny. He calls on the past to transform the future. He remembers the ancestry of Isaiah to prophetically speak to his people and call them higher. And I think if we're really going to move forward, we have to remember our leaders who came before us. We're going to have to remember what the Christian clarion call of what Jesus's ministry is all about, taking care of the least, the lost, the last, the left out, the overlooked, the underserved, and the underrepresented. It doesn't stop solely at salvation, but it moves into uprooting racial oppression. And I think we have been anointed to be a social structure change agent. And I think that really is the focus of on the real message of Jesus. He's born in the boroughs of Bethlehem. He's nestled in the neighborhoods of Nazareth. He grew up in the ghettos of Galilee. Jesus, with feet like bronze and hair like wool, an unarmed Black man, was assassinated, executed, killed, murdered by a corrupt government as a public spectacle. And so when you think about it, his resurrection is an insurrection. It literally is that which is an insurrection against injustice. You can't talk about scripture and divorce struggle. You can't talk about Jesus and not include justice. And something is wrong, as Dr. Edmonds mentioned and Pastor Facey mentioned, that when we have white evangelical pastors who care more about Black tithes than they do Black lives, you know, who think white slavery, Black slavery is a white blessing. Something's wrong with that. And you can't preach to Black souls and not connect to Black suffering. Micah 6:8 mentioned, what does the Lord require of thee? To do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly before thy God. And so I think when we really get to the place of liberation theology, understanding that God shows up for the oppressed, God shows up for the brokenhearted, God shows up for those who are not just on the top, but at the bottom, that we don't just preach blessing, but we preach how to handle suffering. And so I think that's what we look at now, making Matthew 25 come alive. Once we begin to understand that, now we see Jesus in John 20 and 20. In 2020 is what we're experiencing, that he breathed on the disciples. Black America is gasping for air. Black church members are gasping for air. We're waiting to exhale. We've been suffocated and we're trying to catch our breath. And so now I think is the time for us as pastors and leaders and preachers and teachers not to have prophetic laryngitis, but to literally cry loud and spare not, and understand that let everything that hath breath praise the Lord, because as you have a pulse, you also have a purpose to change the system and the structure of society.
Oh, so good, Dr. Eddie. Thank you so much. That's so good. Listen, guys, we just wrapped our entire segment. We did it. It's been amazing. It's been a great time. Listen, I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, and as we get to wrap here, we will we'll revisit this conversation, because I believe this is an ongoing conversation. This is just not for today. We're going to be talking about this a lot, but as leaders, as change agents in the community, we get to have these conversations to educate our viewers and the people who follow us. So what I want to ask, and this question is going to be for Attorney Kimmick, and Mr. Smalley, you can answer this as well. We talked about, different tips that you can use when it comes to being pulled over. And Dominique asked this question. She says, what is the tone of voice that I should have when I'm speaking to a police officer? And the reason why I'm asking this question is because, as simple as that, we have to ask, is there an incorrect way to have a conversation when you're being pulled over? So what does that look like when we're getting pulled over, if we're in a situation with a police officer? Is there a specific tone of voice, or does it even matter?
I actually think that's probably a better question for the chief. Andrew, you want to take that?
Yeah, when you talk about tone, your tone is your tone. I mean, you don't have to change. I think maybe you're referring to maybe the excitement of it. You're going to be excited. You don't want to yell at the officer. You don't want to be, I'm trying to look for a different word, but I can't get it, but disrespectful, okay? The first words coming out of your mouth as the person that's being stopped shouldn't be, why are you stopping me? You can ask that question for certain, but that shouldn't be the first question coming out, because what that shows is almost an aggression towards the officer, like, you shouldn't be stopping me. And, I've had people telling me, don't you have better things to do? There's criminals out there, and so on and so forth. That doesn't benefit the person that's being stopped. So as far as tone, I think that, as long as you're even keeled, we go back to not offering more than you're asked. I think Attorney Kimmick made a real good point that you don't have to answer questions. You really don't. When the officer asks you for your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. That's it. You don't have to answer anything further. You can sit in your car. You can say to the officer, am I free to go? And if they're leaving, if there's reasons why they're keeping you there, they should be explaining that to you. In answer to that question, you use your tone. There's nothing we have to put on a certain face. You shouldn't have to put on a face. Be yourself, but know your rights and know the processes that we've talked about in this discussion.
That's good. Thank you. I have a question, and anyone can answer this who can give this information. But John Ali Facey says, at this point in time, do you feel that Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans are united enough to be equally committed to the work at hand to affect change that's needed? Don't all answer at the same time. Anybody can go. Just have to take your call off of mute there.
Well, I am an Afro-Caribbean person, and I am united. Unfortunately, I don't live in an Afro-Caribbean community. I don't live in a Black community now. I live in Knox County, Ohio, where I think 1% of the population is African American, including me. It's a very small community here, but I think some people who live in South Florida or elsewhere are probably better to answer that question. But I think we really all have to be united. And I mean, I think what you see from around the world, protests in Africa, protests in Europe, protests in the Caribbean, I think all of us feel at this moment that this is the time, and we're ready to work together to do this.
Yeah, I second that. I'm Afro-Caribbean as well. I lost the accent. I used to live in Kingston, Jamaica. My father's side, West Indian, and so grew up in Kingston, Jamaica. But I'm reminded of Marcus Garvey, who said, up you mighty race, accomplish what you will. And so I think what we're seeing is a galvanizing. I've talked to people in South Africa, done interviews there, and Jamaica just within the past few weeks. And I think now the message, because oftentimes when America sneezes, everybody else gets the flu. And we're seeing the whole aspect of what it is with our brothers and sisters who in many cases are coming together. But we're also still dealing with, for Jamaica, for instance, colorism, where we're seeing even brothers and sisters on the island bleaching their skin. So, when you're saying Black Lives Matter with a sign, but you're not believing it when you look at the mirror, then there's a message that's not coming clear there. So I think it's happening with conversations like this, with us channeling and challenging, but also sharing the message of what it is that we're hearing tonight, and especially for our African Caribbean brothers and sisters who are getting all this wealth of wisdom tonight. I think the onus on you now and the responsibility is, what will you do with what you've been given? To whom much is given, much is required. It's required that you share it. It's required that you begin to have critical, courageous conversations. It's required that you begin to channel and challenge to bring about change, in our communities. And so we're better together. And I think we got to have collaboration over competition.
So good.
I agree with both, that we have to come together. I guess my concern would be whether, I know now we're coming together on an issue, which is police brutality, which leads to the identification of racism. Howsoever, I don't know whether we are all together on the issues, because clearly these are not all of the issues that are facing us, and there has to be a coming together of both Caribbean African Americans and what we call ourselves African Americans, even though I've never been to Africa, but there has to be a coming together because of the strength of our case now. But I do say this, that in the conversation, we need to continue the conversation until it leads to productivity. And the only way we're going to get productivity, like Dr. Edmonds and Dr. Connor said, is if we come together. If we have show any type of weakness in the armor, then the enemy will attack us. So it's very imperative that we come together and work together, not just on the current issue that's facing us with the incident of Mr. Floyd, but now is the time that we come together, sit down at the table, as Dr. Fossey has said. We sit down at the table and we lay out all our cards on the table and say, we're gonna come together. Let's not, this is just the focal point, but let's bring all of these issues together and start working on them collectively until we get a conclusion.
Wonderful. I have one last, somebody wants to touch on that?
Well, I want to, underscore what our brother just said, because I think one of the dangers in this time is that we can become blinded by symbolism. For example, we can change the flag in Mississippi, we can take down the statues in various places, and then we wash our hands and we go back to our own way. But I think we have to keep their feet to the fire so that we move beyond symbolism. I mean, you can pass the Voting Rights Act, or you can pass the Civil Rights Bill, but the economic and social and cultural system of racism remain in place. And I think this is the time when we should remove root and branches and make sure that we are not just blinded by getting some symbolic actions, but also a change in the structure of the society in such a way that equality is engraved and all of us feel a part of the society. And so I think that would be my last word to us, that, let's not just be blinded by the symbolism. A lot of people are waiting, big business and the NFL and all those people, and they're doing all these things, saying Black Lives Matter and so on and so forth. But are they going to change the structure of the system? Are Black coaches going to be hired? Are people going to have their freedom to speak their mind in the NFL and the NBA? So let's keep their feet to the fire and not just be satisfied by symbolic actions.
Oh, so good, Dr. Edmonds. Thank you so much. Listen, we have one last question. Was that good for everybody? Oh my goodness, this is such an awesome conversation. I want to just say thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you for taking the time to be here tonight. Time out of your day to address this very serious topic. And I'm just so appreciative. And thank you so much to all of our viewers who tuned in tonight and who are a part of this much needed conversation. Thank you for your engagement and just being present here. So I have one last question, and then we're going to close out. As you guys can see, for all of our viewers, we are writing any information for any of the panelists. So if you would like to reach out to them, or if you would like to connect with them, you can do so as we continue to post that in the comments if you have any further questions for them. And then before we close out, anybody who is running for anything, or if you have anything that you would like to share about any upcoming events or anything, we'll give you an opportunity to share that as well. So the question is, if anyone, can answer this, how do we best temper ourselves when trying to get our Black point across? That we are at the stage of being tired, exhausted, beyond Black on Black crime and all the issues that we as Blacks deal with. We so desperately want the other side to see our pain and come alongside with us. So how do we not act out in the constant state of rage that we're sometimes known for? And how do we just channel this anger, or what do we do with this anger and this frustration? What do we do? What are some tips for the people?
I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about we have to be strategic about what we do. We have to clearly identify what the issues are that we're fighting, know the battle we're fighting, and then we have to organize around that. Because to be honest with you, just simply being precipitous emotionally and reacting to the issues that we see, that's not really going to bring about change. We have to understand how the system works. And much like I said, there are policies, there are laws, there are best practices, these kind of things continue to funnel the behaviors that we see. And we're not going to change behaviors except we change those reasons, those whys that are there. And so I do think we have to step back a little. We have to look at where the like-minded people are. We have to look at where the power brokers are, and we have to find ways to strategically pull those together. So we have to be thinking about what we're trying to do. And as we pull that together strategically now, we can mobilize around those things. So I do think we have some work to do as far as that is concerned. We can't afford to be disjointed. And I think the bigger conversation that we were pointing to, we didn't get there tonight, is that this might not just simply be a white-black issue. This might be a minority versus majority issue, okay? And that means that all minorities. And so if we can get that conversation where we can organize those different minority groups, and we'll have the power, we'll have the resources, we'll have the people power to make the changes that we need to see.
Awesome.
And I'll just jump in. I agree with Dr. Facey on the power of organization and the power of being strategic. I would push back on the question a little bit. I don't necessarily think folks should be tempered. I think the establishment wants you to be tempered, wants you to very much stay quieter than the rage and the pain that this moment calls for. Mm-hmm. White folks are listening because of the sheer pain that we are seeing in every community across the country in ways that when folks were tempered before, they weren't listening to. And so I think that there is a place or just that folks are pure rage that can be useful.
Awesome. Attorney Kimmick, you are speaking the words that I speak every day. I tell people, you know what, it's okay to feel passion. It's okay to be angry. We're just in a space where as Black people, we are feeling all of the emotions of life. There are 5 stages to grief, and one of those stages are anger. That's where we are as a people. And so it's okay to feel all of that and express it. And I feel like this is how, we cause the change to happen, and I feel like that's okay. So you know what, we are at the end of this. Oh my goodness. Thank you guys so much again for being here, for being present. Pastor Facey, thank you so much for facilitating a phenomenal conversation. We're gonna close out now, but before we do, if anybody has anything coming up, you're running for something, maybe an event or books or whatever we can support you with, please do so. Feel free to share that now.
I'd like to share my website, smallingforsheriff.com, and also to remind everyone to vote. The primary is August 18th. Make sure you register, make sure you vote. That's one of the ways that we do the practical aspect of what we discussed tonight. Thank you.
And I'll just echo Andrew. Our website is www.joekimmock.com. One of the things that we're doing, that we've been doing for a long time, is having lots and lots of conversations like this over social media. We've had a whole lot of conversations with returning citizens, folks that have been locked up, as well as family members and other folks who have been impacted by the system in some way. If you are interested, if you're watching and you're interested in telling your story, Facebook message me or email me. It's joekimmock2020@gmail.com. I would be very, very happy to and honored to have you on our site.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for such a great moderating aspect of what you brought tonight. Thank you, Pastor Facey and Genesis and the LogIn aspect of this tonight for just this transformative conversation with all these incredible power panelists. I'm running for registration. I'm running for registration to where I'm putting together an incredible vision summit You can go and register now, thevisionsummit.org, and it's focused on education, empowerment, and entrepreneurship. CBS mentions that already 40 to 45% of Black business owners have either shut down or are expected to shut down due to COVID. 440,000 of them have already shut their doors due to this aspect of the pandemic. And so I'm trying to give some relief, trying to give not just a stimulus check necessarily, but a reality check with strategy of how people can really pivot and also prosper in the midst of this pandemic. And so July 31st, Friday, July 31st, and Saturday, August 1st, we're having a virtual Vision Summit. And all you have to do is register now. Thevisionsummit.org is just $39 for 2 days. You hear as many as a minimum of 19 speakers, and $19.50 per day if you really break down the math. You can't get a meal from Uber Eats for $39. You can't get your hair done, nail done, everything did for $39. Sure enough, can't fill up your gas tank for $39. And so you're going to hear some incredible voices on education, business, entrepreneurship, social justice, how to do ministry in the marketplace, how to do kingdom, how to merge kingdom culture, community, and corporate all together, and not lose your authenticity, much less your anointing. How to really make not just an income, but also to increase your impact. So it's going to be really life-changing and transformative. And you don't have to come to us. We're bringing it to you from the comfort of your home via computer or phone. So the revolution not only be televised, it'll be digitized. Go to thevisionsummit.org.
This guy is amazing, man. We love you, Dr. Eddie. We'll definitely be supporting that. Thank you guys again. Listen, we're closing out here, and if you would like to definitely sow a seed into the ministry, you can visit mygenesiscc.org, and then you can click to give your tithe or your offering, and then you can choose the Youth Initiative /LogIn 2.0. Remember to follow us on LogIn 2.0 and also our Facebook page for more of some amazing conversations such as this. I want to say thank you guys again for watching, for tuning in. My name is Nikki Price. It is an honor to serve as a team director for LogIn 2.0 at Genesis Christian Church. I've learned so much in a short amount of time, and I feel really, really blessed to have this opportunity. So I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Facey to go ahead and close this out. And that's it, guys. Thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans.
Well, let me just echo the sentiments of Nikki. Thank you so much for being on this panel tonight and for articulating so beautifully. I think this is the beginning, because we have much more work to do. And I'm excited about Andrew and Joe running for office. Listen, these are great candidates, and let's get behind them and support them as well. If we need to see change, these are some of the people we need to see in office. And I'm not kidding. I'm putting it out there because I think it's important. But thank you so much for sharing. And hey, we might call you again because there might be a part 2. So on behalf of Genesis and LogIn, and Nikki, thank you so much. You always just amaze me with your skills and leadership. I want to say thank you for doing this tonight. Thanks, everybody. Love you all. God bless. Let's make change happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Our pleasure.
Hey, Nikki.
You're welcome. Good night, Facebook. Good night, everybody.